What's up, everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Brewing with 50 bucks. This is the show where we take your favorite commanders, we slap on a $50 budget, and not only do we make a deck that is completely functional, but we also make a deck that is able to win you the game. My name is Stefan. I'm coming to you from the General Warfare headquarters. I'm glad you could join us today. Now, before we get started in today's video, I do want to address the mini absence that I've had over the past couple of weeks. I did say I had to get a couple of priorities set in order to start posting weekly, but apparently that has come into a 3-week hiatus, one of which was due to a trip to Quebec City, and one of which was due to a week-long episode of sadness, let's put it. But nonetheless, I'm back on the channel, and it is the first week of June, which is making me very excited because summer is one of my favorite seasons, and the weather is getting a lot nicer. Now, past that point, we have a new set to talk about, and this is Commander Legends Battle for Baldur's Gate. If you haven't been living under a rock already, we've been seeing a lot of spoilers coming out of the set, including a lot of new commander options for you guys, a lot of really fun cards to come out of the set, and one of which I'm going to be talking about in today's video. As you can tell with the thumbnail and the title of this video, you already know who it is. This week's deck tech is on the Council of Four. Now, fun fact about this, the Council of Four is actually based on the Council of Waterdeep from the Rise of Tiamat adventure. For all you D&D fans out there who already know, a little tidbit of fun information for y'all. Now, besides that, I've been checking up on EDH Rec as well, just to see who are some of the more popular options before coming on here and choosing my ultimate deck. I found this commander, and I'm shocked to see that there was only 17 decks at the time of recording made for this command. This looks like a really fun commander to make, because not overall, this is a fun commander to net you some extra cards and potentially some extra bodies on the field. Well, we're gonna add one more deck to that list as we look into the breakdown and strategy of this week's commander. Let's go. So the Council of Four is a 0/8 for 3 white and blue, so 3 in Azorius for a legendary human noble that has the abilities whenever a player draws the second card during their turn, you draw a card. And whenever a player casts their second spell during their turn, you create a 2/2 white knight creature token. So, as I mentioned before, this is a really fun commander, and I can see a lot of people building this deck despite the limitations of it being in blue and in white, only for the fact that Knight's Tribal is pretty strong, and who doesn't like drawing cards? So, the main strategy of our game today is to draw all the cards, make all the tokens, and find one of our convoluted ways of winning the game. And as always, we run these decks with a $50 budget in mind, which includes the price of the commander, which excludes the price of the basic land, and which we also offer a $5 overage compromise. So this deck can be built for roughly $50. The compromise is just available for those who can spare the extra $5 to add into this deck. You can find the deck list for this deck in the show notes down below. And if I can ask of a favor for you guys, like this video, share it with your friends, subscribe if you haven't already, and hit that bell icon to be notified of every video that comes out of this channel. Thank you. So we're gonna be going over the standard array of categories, our initial 6 categories that we usually do for these builds, which will go over our enchantments, our instants, our lands, our creatures, our sorceries, and our artifacts. And usually with these builds, we start with the most cumbersome of categories. In this case, it'll be our creatures. For the most part, this is a creature-based deck since we're gonna be making a lot of knights, but we also have a lot of ways that we're gonna be taking with it. Most of the case is going to be with the draw effects. We're gonna start off with Aven Mind Sensor. Now, you're gonna say this is a little weird for a deck that wants you to draw a lot of cards, and that's Knight Tribal. However, we're adding a bit of stacks into this because we want our opponents to not have as much advantage as we can in order to get to win the game. So blocking them from searching their decks is good advantage for us to be able to capitalize on our opponents not having the extra resources they can get. Baird Steward of Argive is next. This is another little stacks piece that I decided to add in the deck where creatures can't attack you or a planeswalker you control unless their controller pays 1 extra for each of those creatures. Now, we don't run any planeswalker, so that's no worry for us. However, this is a deck that is most likely going to get hated on, so we do want a lot of protection against us. So having a Ghostly Prison style effect or a propaganda style effect on a creature will aid us in being able to prevent a bit of damage coming our way, especially in the short game. Body of Knowledge is next. This is one of the creatures that benefits us having a lot of cards in our hand, where its power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in our hand. That, you also have no maximum hand size, and when the Body of Knowledge is dealt damage, you draw that many cards. So this is a pretty good win-win for you, as you don't have any max hand size, so however many cards you have in your hand, even if it's in excess over 7, the creature gets a lot bigger, and whenever it's dealt damage, you draw that many cards. So what's not to love about this? Dream Trawler is next. This is actually one of my favorite cards from when Theros Beyond Death came out. That was actually the last official pre-release I was part of before the pandemic hit. But nonetheless, a 3/5 flying lifelinker where whenever you draw a card, it'll get +1/+0 until end of turn. When it attacks, you draw a card, and you can even discard a card to give it hexproof. This is a very good, very rounded card. It's just a little expensive at 6 mana. 2 generic, 2 white, and 2 blue. But the fact that you're pumping up a creature for whenever you draw a card, the fact that you draw a card whenever you attack, and you can give it hexproof by discarding a card, is just good value on a creature. Fog Bank is next, another very innocuous card, but the reason we're adding this in is the fact that we need some protection in the short game. Howling Golem is next, and I decided to add this just for fun, because the fact that you can get a creature that can, whenever attacks or blocks, let you draw a card, well, it says each player, but this includes you as well, is really good, especially if you're drawing 2 cards each during your turn. You're getting that extra card from the council on the field. Isperia Supreme Judge is next, a 6/4 flying. Whenever a creature attacks you or in a planeswalker you control, which you don't have any, you may draw a card. Again, another 6 mana big beefer. But in this case, this doesn't have any lifelink and doesn't have any protection on it. I'm keeping this in the event that anybody tries to attack. We can draw an extra card, and that way we can get some more information and some more ways to have fun and play around in this deck. Kami of the Crescent Moon is next, and for each wheel deck or just an extra draw deck, I feel Kami is just a staple in it, as at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. So you're drawing 2 cards each turn, and with the council on the field, you're drawing an extra 1. So 3 cards per turn is never a bad decision. Knight of the White Orchid is next, and I feel this is just a clean staple card, especially in white, since white doesn't have a lot of good ramp in the soul color itself, so having something that allows you to search your library for a land and or planes in this case, and put onto the battlefield untapped is really, really strong, especially if you're lacking behind the land department. Quain Itinerant Meddler is next. This was a card I was trying to figure out for the longest time what to put in a deck and how to build it as a commander. I'm glad I found it in the deck itself, but with it, the tap ability being each player may draw a card, and each player who did gains 1 life. So why are you gonna say no to an extra card in your hand? Unless your opponents, if they don't draw, they don't get an extra life. If they draw, they get an extra life. So it's a win-win for them as well. Lavina Azorius Renegade is next, and this is just another little stacks piece we have for our opponents, where each opponent can't cast non-creature spells with converted mana cost greater than the number of lands that player controls. And whenever an opponent casts a spell, if no mana was spent to cast it, you counter that spell. So this pretty much limits what our opponents can play, as long as they have less mana than the needed converted mana cost of their deck, or of the card that they're trying to play. But with that, having an extra body on the field is never a bad thing. 1, 2, you're limiting your opponent's resources and what they can play. And 3, if they try to storm out or play some spells for free, they can't do it because Lavina will counter it. Meteor Golem is next, and I just figured I'd add this in, even though it is 7 mana, because there's not a lot of destroy permanents in this deck. So Meteor Golem would fit in perfectly, especially as a 7-drop. Destroying a target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Nadir Kraken is next, and again, this is another card I've been trying to figure out what to do with, but this is just some extra spice, and it's kind of cheap as well. So whenever you draw a card, you can pay an additional 1, and if you do, put a +1/+1 counter on the Kraken, and create a 1/1 blue tentacle creature token. So you're getting a bigger creature, and you're getting a secondary creature next to it, so why the hell not? Nezahal Primal Tide is next. This is another big creature that we want on the field, and with this, you have no maximum hand size. Whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, you draw a card, and you discard 3 to basically just blink Nezahal. When you're drawing so many cards a turn, what's 3 cards for you? And to boot, a 7/7 that has no maximum hand size and can't be countered is always a really good thing. Psychosis Crawler is next, and this is one of our couple of little ways of winning. Psychosis Crawler reads, whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. And with the Council, we're gonna be drawing extra cards each turn. If we draw 2 cards, we get an extra card, and that's gonna deal an extra damage from the Psychosis Crawler. And the fact that we have multiple ways to get no maximum hand size in this deck, it's gonna be just a no-brainer that the Psychosis Crawler is gonna be a big, no pun intended, horror for our opponents. Scholarship Sponsor is next. This is quite a new card that I've just recently discovered, and I thought it fit in very well in a deck that included white. So what it reads is, whenever it enters the battlefield, each player who controls fewer land than the player who controls the most lands searches the library for a number of basic land cards less than or equal to the difference. Put those cards on the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. So against any green deck that ramps super hard, Scholarship Sponsor kind of just absolutely gets you to exactly where you need to be in relation to the speed of those kind of decks. It basically puts you on par to where they're at. If the green deck is on 7 mana or 7 lands by turn 3 or turn 4, you just drop Scholarship Sponsor and you get to that exact land count that they have. Solemn Simulacrum is next. Pretty standard card. Whenever he enters, you search for a land, put it onto the battlefield, tap and shuffle. When he dies, you draw a card. Sun Titan is next. Again, another good staple white card in any budget deck altogether, because whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you can return a target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. And now notice, this is permanent, so this can include your creatures, enchantments, artifacts, and even your lands too, if you have lands that fetches you other lands. Walking Archive is next, and this is a really funny card that I've decided to add in this deck after contemplation, because it comes into play with a +1/+1 counter on it, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player draws a card for each +1/+1 counter on Walking Atlas, and you just pay 4 mana to put a +1/+1 counter on it. In playtesting, I was able to do 3 counters each turn with the amount of mana I was generating off each turn. I was able to play lands and other accelerations. So by the end of that playtest, it was roughly around, each player would draw 7 cards a turn based off the Walking Atlas. Having opponents draw that many cards will very quickly deck them out. At that rate, it'll quickly thin out your opponent's decks, and the fact that we'll have a limited amount of resources to deal with or to worry about in the long run, because most of our opponents will not have maximum hand sizes. It's just gonna be a walk in the park for the Walking Atlas. The last of our creatures is our Windborn Muse. Now, this is another one of our Ghostly Princeton propaganda type effects, where creatures can't attack you unless their controller pays 2 for each creature they control that's attacking you. So we have an extra ability on par with that, just to give us a little bit of extra protection. Next category we're gonna be going over is our instants. Now, the way I usually like to build my decks is I like a lot of instant speed interaction. With that, we're able to play on a level where we can interact with our opponents, especially not on our turns, but more so on our opponent's turns, especially so. And we're gonna get started first off with Aetherize. So returning all attacking creatures to their owner's hand is always a good thing, especially if they're about to blow you out of the game and they have a full swing coming your way. Just play Aetherize and their entire field is gone. Arcane Denial is next. It's a pretty standard card. You counter a spell, its controller can draw up to 2 cards, and you draw a card at the beginning of the next upkeep. So this is just extra card draw for you. Brainstorm is next. Draw 3, and then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library in any order for 1 blue mana. Next up is Counterspell. It's the standard for a reason. 2 blue to counter a spell. Dream Fracture is next. You counter a target spell, its controller draws a card, and you can draw a card as well. Emergency Powers is next. Now, this is a card I contended about taking out of the deck, but just for the fact that it gives you a little bit of an additional benefit for playing it on your main phase is really good. So whenever you play it, it's each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library and then draws 7 cards, and then you exile the emergency powers. That's their instant speed. But the addendum is if you cast a spell during your main phase, you can put a permanent card with converted mana cost 7 or less from your hand onto the battlefield. This rocks, especially in playtesting, because when I'm able to just go through my entire hand of like instant sorceries and then have an entire pile of a graveyard, I can just play emergency powers to get my entire graveyard back into my library and then just cast something for 7 mana for absolutely free. Fact or Fiction is next, another very prominent blue staple. Reveal the top 5 cards of your library. An opponent separates those cards into 2 piles. Put one pile into your hand and the other into your graveyard. Generous Gift is next, and everybody knows this card at this point, so say it with me. Destroy target permanent. Its controller creates a 3/3 green elephant creature token. Negate is next, another staple blue card. Counter target non-creature spell for 1 and a blue. Pongify is next. This I decided to add in over Rapid Hybridization because Rapid Hybridization is a lot more expensive, and this is just a 1 mana kill creature spell. Although its controller creates a 3/3 green ape in its place, it's still getting rid of a big scary creature that could be a threat to you. Render Silent is next, and for white, blue, counter target spell if controller can't cast spells this turn. So you're pretty much just completely silencing your opponent from playing spells for that entire round. Saw It Coming is next, 3 mana for a counter spell, or you can foretell it for 1 and a blue. Swords to Plowshare is next, staple white card, exile target creature, and its controller gains life equal to its power. Wash Away is next. Now, this is a card I saw from Crimson Vow that I wish more people were playing, but basically for 1 blue mana, this counters a spell that wasn't cast from its owner's hand, which includes the command zone because it's not being cast from their hand. So you can effectively counter commander cards from being played. But for 3 mana, you basically could just remove the bracketed text to just counter a spell for 3 mana, but it's so much fun just to counter a commander for 1 blue mana. Words of Wisdom is next. For two mana, 1 and a blue, you draw 2 cards, then each other player can draw a card. And the last of our instance is Wrong Turn. I decided to add this just for the memes, because basically target opponent gains control of target creature. And this is a permanent effect. So it doesn't last until end of turn. It just gives an opponent one of your opponent's creatures just for memes. Our next category is our artifacts. We're running quite a bit of artifact ramp in this deck, and we also have a few funny little things to add in here as well. We're gonna start off with Arcane Signet. This is a pretty standard card to add in Commander nowadays, as it's just 2 mana to play, and you get to tap it for 1 mana of any color in your Commander's color identity. Next up, we're gonna look at all 3 Azorius Cluestone, Azorius Locket, and Azorius Signet. All of these allow you to generate white or a blue. The Locket and the Azorius Cluestone allow you to draw cards by sacrificing them, and the Signet is just tap 1 to tap it to add 2 mana of both of those colors. Commander Sphere is next. It's a staple, it's a standard card that I add in almost every single Commander deck. Thalwar Stone is next. I'm surprised this card has dropped in value over time, but nonetheless, 2 mana to cast it, and to tap it to add a 1 mana of any color that a land an opponent controls could produce. Folio of Fancies is next, and now this is where things get fun, because players have no maximum hand size, and then the fun part is that XX. For X and then tap it, each player draws X cards. And then 2 in a blue and tap it, each opponent puts a number of cards equal to the number of cards in their hand from the top of their library into their graveyard. So if opponents don't have a massive hand, you could just make them draw extra cards, or you could just easily just mill them with a folio. Midnight Clock is next. Basically, you tap it for a blue mana, 2 in a blue, you put an hour counter on the Midnight Clock, and at the beginning of each upkeep, you put an hour counter on the Midnight Clock. And then when the 12th hour counter is put on Midnight Clock, you shuffle your hand and graveyard into your library and then draw 7 cards, and then you exile the clock itself. It's basically like timed emergency powers, minus the addendum part to it. But it also lets you add a blue along with it. Soul Ring is next. I decided to add Soul Ring in just because it's gonna give us a bit of extra acceleration and get our commander out a little bit earlier. Next one is the Circle of Loyalty. Now, I figured as much that this is a pseudo knight deck as well, so why not have a few things that cater to knights? So basically the circle will cost less for each knight you control, and with our commander we create knights whenever a player casts two spells each turn. Creatures you control get +1/+1. Whenever you cast a legendary spell, you create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance, I should say. And then 3 and a white and tap it to create a 2/2 white knight creature with token with vigilance. So it costs less from our commander making knights. It gives our knights an anthem ability. And with every legendary spell we have, we get an extra knight on the field. Victory Chimes is next. This is just a funny little card I decided to add in where it untaps during each other player's untap step, and then a player of our choice can add a colorless. Lastly, Wayfarer's Bauble. This somehow dropped in price a significant amount, but it's such an easy card to add in because for 1 mana, you play it and then 2, tap it and sacrifice it. Search your library for your basic land card, put that card onto the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle your library. Next, we're gonna be going over our enchantments. We're running 9 enchantments in this deck, a lot of which very much interacts with our commander as it does affect a lot of our draws. Or rather, everybody's draws, I should say. Starting off with Dictative Crucifix. With this, it's a 3 mana enchantment with flash, so you can play it at any point. And at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. Everybody's drawing 2 cards each turn, which means we'll be drawing an extra card for each player drawing 2 cards. So why not? You can do this on somebody's upkeep, and then you draw the card for the 2 cards that they draw. Hilarious. Next is Island Sanctuary. So this is a much older card, and I don't know if this counteracts a couple of cards we run in our deck, but I'll read it out to you, basically, saying that if you would draw a card during your draw step, instead you may skip the draw, and if you do, until your next turn, you can't be attacked except by creatures with flying and or island walk. So this negates almost every single creature your opponents could be playing, unless they're playing like a flying tribal or just have an abundance of flyers or island walk creatures. But the fact that you can skip your draw step to not get attacked by your opponents is so good. Next up, we're gonna be going over our 4 mini win cons. Starting off with Jace's Erasure, Psychic Corrosion, Sphinx's Tutelage, and Teferi's Tutelage. So each of these basically allows us, whenever we draw a card, to mill either each opponent or target opponent. But each of these, stacking them on top of each other, is gonna provide such benefits, especially with the amount of draw that we have in our deck, especially with the Dictated Crucifix. So we have a lot of draw going our way, and the fact that we're drawing an extra card for the 2 cards, for each 2 cards our opponents are drawing, I should say. Each one of them will allow us to mill a target opponent or each opponent, depending on what it is. Next up is Ominous Seas. So whenever you draw a card, you put a foreshadowing counter on the seas and then remove 8 foreshadowing counters to create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. And it has cycling, but we're not gonna be using the cycling too often because this is a fun little win con. We create Krakens at pretty much a whim because we're gonna be drawing so many cards on our turn. Now the next card I think is a pretty big non-bow with Island Sanctuary, but we're gonna get into it anyways. The next card is Solitary Confinement. This is just a really funny card I decided to add in the deck because basically you sacrifice it unless you discard your card at the beginning of your upkeep. You skip your draw step, you have Shroud, so you can't be the target of any spell or abilities, and you prevent all damage that would be dealt to you. So you can get attacked with Solitary Confinement on the field and you won't take any damage. You can't be the target of any spell or ability, and you skip your draw step. So effectively, you won't be able to deck yourself unless you forcefully deck yourself, unless you forcefully draw your cards. And the last one is Well of Ideals. For 6 mana, whenever it enters the battlefield, you draw 2 cards. Beginning of each other player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and the beginning of your draw step, you draw 2 additional cards. Extra cards coming in clutch for us, because we're gonna be drawing this alongside the Dictate on our turn. If we don't have Solitary Confinement or a way to skip our draw step, we basically would be drawing 5 cards along with the Council. 5 cards each turn is really scary to be for our opponents to have to deal with, and the fact that we're making them draw 2 additional cards as well, while we get an additional card on our side of the field or in our hand, will make them very worried and afraid, which is what we want them to be. Our second to last category we'll be going over is our sorceries. We're only running 6 sorceries, which I think is one of the lowest categories that we've had on this channel. But nonetheless, a lot of them don't really do too much. It's just for big game plays. The first of which is Approach of the Second Sun. This is just an alternative win con for us because the fact that we're drawing so many cards, it just makes it most sense for us to play this card. Approach says whenever you cast a spell from your hand, if you cast another spell named Approach, you win the game. Otherwise, put Approach the Sun into the owner's library 7th from the top and you gain 7 life. The extra 7 life is pretty good, especially when you're in a pickle, but you basically want to cast it a second time for that win. That being said, well, you just put it 7th from the top, and the amount of cards that we're drawing a turn will make it so that we get Approach of the Second Sun a lot sooner than our opponents will actually get Approach. Dusk Till Dawn is next. This is just one of our very few board wipes that we run in this deck, where for 4 mana you destroy all creatures with power 3 or greater, which will not affect the Council of 4, which is really good because it's a 0/8. And the aftermath part is you just return all creature cards with power 2 or less from your graveyard to your hand, which is not bad because we have a lot of cards that basically will go back into our hand if we have a gigantic graveyard just full of creatures. Preordain is next. Scry 2 and then draw a card, just an extra card draw ability. Promise of Loyalty is next, where each player puts a vow counter on a creature they control and sacrifices the rest. Each of those creatures can attack you or planeswalkers you control for as long as it has a vow counter on it. So there are not too many ways to get rid of counters in the game itself, even vow counters as it stands. But the fact that you basically would be pseudo board wiping, and the fact that your opponents won't be able to attack you with creatures that have vow counters on them makes everything so much better for you. Secret Rendezvous is next. For 3 mana, 2 white. You and target opponent each draw 3 cards. Especially pair this up with the Tutelages or Psychic Corrosion, where you're gonna be milling your opponents out. Is such a good thing because if you stack each one of the triggers, you could be potentially milling somebody for 7 cards for each draw. And lastly, Time Wipe. Return a creature to your control to its owner's hand, then destroy all creatures. So basically you want to return the council so that way you could play without having to pay the commander tax and just board wipe. Simple enough. Our last category that we're going to get into is our land base. So this is a usual thing for us because the lands more often than not are the least interesting part of our deck unless it's the main focus. For this, it is not the focus and it's just the fuel that drives our engine a little bit further. Starting off, we have Command Tower, which is a pretty standard card for any commander that is running more than one color. You add 1 mana of any color to your commander's color identity. Next is Evolving Wilds, Myriad Landscape, and Terramorphic Expanse. I've talked enough about this, but to give you a brief reminder of what they do, you sacrifice each one of them to grab a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Myriad Landscape does a little bit more as it comes into play tapped, adds 1 colorless, and then you tap 2 and then tap it and sacrifice it to search for 2 basic land cards, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Gaia Reef Sanitarium is next. You add a colorless and then 2 and tap it. Each player draws a card, then discards a card. Skycloud Expanse is next. This is just an additional Azorius Signet where on a land, so it's a little bit harder to destroy. Temple of Alignment to come into play tap and then allows you to scry. Temple of the False God, it just gives you 2 extra mana as long as you have 5 or more lands. And we're also running 14 islands and 14 plains. That's how you build a council comprised of 4 compatrons. And with our deck total of $50, which includes the price of the commander and excludes the price of the basic lands, which also includes the overage compromise, we come to a deck total of $56.95, which makes it, technically speaking, over budget. Yes, especially with the compromise, it is about $1.95 over, $2 more if you want to round it up. But in some places, you can replace some other cards with some cheaper amounts, like you can add Chasm Skulker in place of some cards that are over $3. You can even reduce some cards to cards that are just as effective for 50 cents. But this is just my brew, and this is just a fun little functional skeleton that we're running with for a complete deck for you guys to play around. Now, without further ado, we're gonna get into some pros, some cons, and some out of budget recommendations for y'all. So we're gonna start off the pros and cons list with some of our pros. The first of which is that it's extremely consistent and netting some extra cards. So as you can tell from all the card draw that we have in this deck, whether it be Dictative Crewfix, whether it be Well of Ideals, or any of the other cards I've mentioned already, this allows you to draw so many cards while also allowing your opponents to draw so many cards as well. So the consistency to allow you to get some extra cards into your hands and some extra knowledge for yourself that your opponents won't know is really, really good. And more often than not can make your land drops every turn, which is a very important thing for a deck that doesn't have too much ramp in it. And I say that with all the ramp I just explained, but for the most part, the deck is completely shuffled and everything's randomized. So more often than not, you may not hit your land drops immediately, but with the amount of cards you're drawing each turn, you're more often than not, like I said, able to make your land drops per turn than most other decks would. And you can sufficiently build up a token board presence with the amount of spells you play each turn. Now, a reminder, for every second spell each player plays, you get that extra knight on the field. So if you play 2 spells a turn, you create a knight, you draw 2 cards a turn, you draw an extra card. So you can easily build up your board presence, and especially with the circle of loyalty coming out on the field, they'll get a little boost, and you can even poop out some more tokens for you. Some of the cons in this deck is that you're most likely going to be the first person to get targeted. This is just a glaring observation, as this deck basically makes you win a lot faster than your opponents will. The fact that you're drawing so many cards a turn will make your opponents very scared of you. The fact that you're going to be milling your opponents will make them target you very, very much faster. It's almost like the debate for Infect. So with Infect, as long as you have 10 poison counters, you lose the game. And whenever somebody plays Infect, more often than not, the rest of the table will gang up on that player. I feel it's the same thing with Mill, but to a lesser degree. You're drawing so many cards, you're playing so many spells, and they'll make you draw more cards. You could end up decking yourself too. There's no consistent win con in the deck as well. As I mentioned, we do have a couple of win cons. I think Psychosis Crawler, all the mill cards, and Approach of the Second Stun are the 3 that we gear more towards most, but all of them are very fragile and can easily be either countered or destroyed. There's only a limited supply of counter spells that you have in this deck, so use them as wisely as you can, because for the sheer purpose of not trying to overextend or just being cocky, the fact that you need to protect your commander, you need to protect the rest of your board is going to be very important for you. And so don't play counter spells lightly. And now we're going to get into our out of budget recommendations. So as mentioned before, these decks are usually built with a $50 budget in mind. These out of budget recommendations are for those who want to take this deck a step further and add a little bit more money to it to make it that much better. The first card that we're going to talk about is Smuggler's Share. So with Smuggler's Share at each end step, you draw a card for each opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn. Then you create a treasure token for each opponent who has 2 or more lands enter the battlefield this turn. This is really good, especially with all the cards I mentioned before that allow your opponents to draw 2 extra cards. You're getting more advantage over your opponents with the Smuggler's Share. It's a little bit pricey at $35 currently, but for the fact that you can get token, treasures, and extra card draw, I wouldn't put it past it. Next up is Smothering Tithe. Now, if I were building this deck without a $50 price in mind, this would be the first card I would add in the deck, because for the most part, you're making your opponents draw a crap ton of cards. And for each one of those cards, that a player has to pay 2, or you just create a treasure token. So if you're making your opponents draw 7 cards a turn, and they can't pay for those extra 2. They can't pay 2 for each one of those. So if they can't pay the 14, you're getting 7 treasures. That's really good, especially if you have a lot of mana to spare, because you'll have a lot of mana to spare, I should say. Windfall is next, and I debated putting this card in, but for the fact that it's $4.50, I could not justify it. But this would be an amazing card to pair up with, like I said, with the Smothering Tithe, with all the mill effects that we have in this deck, because you're gonna be the one with the most cards in hand most of the time. And if you Windfall, you're gonna be drawing an insurmountable amount of cards. 1, 2, you're gonna be milling your opponents for an insurmountable amount of damage. And if you have the Psychosis Crawler, you're gonna be dealing them a lot of damage as well. And the last one, and this could be a very glaring one too, Consecrated Sphinx. I really think that, especially for the fact that you're drawing 2 extra cards each turn, and whenever your opponent draws a card, you draw an additional 2. This will help you draw extra cards in your hand. But also, it's a 4/6, so it can get in for some extra damage against your opponents too. Well guys, I'm gonna leave it off there today, but I wanna ask you guys, did you guys like this build? Are there any other commanders from Baldur's Gate you want me to take a look at? And were there any cards that you feel should have been in this list? Let me know in the comments down below, and if you like this kind of content, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and hitting that bell icon if you haven't done already, because not only would it help, not only would I appreciate it, but it also helps the channel grow and expand out to get some more views on the channel. And you can also follow me on my socials. I'm gonna have a link in the bottom of this video for my Facebook, my Instagram, and my Twitter. I recently deleted TikTok because I no longer support that platform, me personally. No more TikTok for this channel. It's gonna be Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter as far going forward. And for the time being, I'm posting every second week on Fridays, so you can catch me on YouTube here. Every video that'll come out will be premiere, so if you want to catch the live streams or if you want to catch the live premiere of the video, you're more than welcome to do so. And I want to thank you guys once again for your patience regarding this issue, regarding the wait and everything. I hope you guys enjoy Baldur's Gate once it comes out. And I'll see you guys in the next video, whether it'll be another brew, another game, or we'll see you in the horizons. But until then, cheers, everybody.